On the coldest night of the year, an elderly widow woke to a strange sound coming from her barn. When she opened the door, she found a newborn baby wrapped in rags, barely breathing. Her old horse, a gentle giant she'd raised for 20 years, was lying curled around the child, keeping it alive through the freezing darkness. But the real shock came when the police discovered who had left the baby there, and why. Elena Vance, a 78-year-old widow, lived alone on a remote farm in northern Minnesota. That night, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. A newborn left in those conditions usually perishes within 30 minutes. When paramedics arrived, they braced for a body. Instead, they found a living infant, sheltered by an old horse who had wrapped himself around the child. But the real shock came from the note pinned to the blanket, a message that would unravel a secret hidden for decades. The note was written on a torn piece of paper, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. Just 6 words: "Please keep him safe. Forgive me." No signature, no date, nothing to identify who had walked through knee-deep snow in sub-zero darkness to leave a newborn in a stranger's barn. Sheriff Tom Barrett arrived within the hour, a man who'd spent 30 years in rural law enforcement and thought he'd seen every kind of desperation. He stood in Elena's barn, watching the paramedics wrap the baby in thermal blankets, watching the old horse, a bay gelding named Samson, refuse to move away from the child, nickering softly as if trying to comfort him. Barrett had worked cases where parents abandoned infants at hospitals or fire stations under safe haven laws, but this was different. This was a deliberate act of exposure, risking a baby's life in a freezing barn. Unless the person who left him there knew something about Samson that no outsider could have known. Elena Vance had lived on that farm for 53 years. She and her husband, William, had moved there as newlyweds, dreaming of raising a family surrounded by acres of pasture and the quiet rhythms of rural life. William had been a farrier, known for his gentle hands with nervous horses, and Samson had been his last gift to Elena before a heart attack took him in his sleep 14 years earlier. The horse was ancient now, arthritic and mostly retired, but Elena kept him out of love and loyalty. She'd always said Samson had an almost human sense for suffering. He'd once stood vigil over a wounded doe for hours until a game warden arrived. But this was something else. A newborn child, abandoned in his stall, and Samson had simply lowered himself onto the hay beside the baby, his massive body radiating heat, his breath warming the air around the infant's face. The doctor at the county hospital later told Barrett that without that animal's warmth, the baby would not have survived past the first hour. The horse hadn't just kept the baby alive. He'd done so with an intentionality that defied explanation. The baby, a boy with a full head of dark hair and a tiny birthmark on his left shoulder, was healthy despite the ordeal. No signs of abuse, no withdrawal symptoms, just the mild hypothermia they'd expect from exposure. The hospital staff named him Sam while he awaited placement with Child Protective Services. Meanwhile, Barrett began the investigation, starting with the note. The paper was ordinary, a page torn from a small notepad, the kind sold at any drugstore. The ink was black ballpoint. Forensics would later reveal a partial fingerprint, but no match in any database. The words themselves, though, began to haunt Elena. "Forgive me." She'd heard that phrase before, spoken in a voice she'd tried to forget. Elena had a daughter. Her name was Margaret, but everyone called her Maggie. She'd been bright and headstrong, a girl who rode horses bareback through the fields and wrote poetry in a journal she kept locked in her nightstand. She'd left for college in Minneapolis at 18, promising to come home every weekend, and for a while she had. Then the calls grew shorter, the visits fewer. Then came the phone call that shattered the Vance household, Maggie had been arrested for possession, caught up in a circle of friends her parents had never met. There were fights, desperate pleas, failed attempts at rehab. And then, on a night much like the one when the baby was found, Maggie had disappeared. That was 22 years ago. Elena hadn't seen or heard from her since. Not a word, not a letter, not even a whisper through the town's relentless gossip network. She'd resigned herself to the belief that Maggie was either dead or simply didn't want to be found. When Sheriff Barrett mentioned the note's handwriting, Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She retrieved one of Maggie's old journals from a trunk in the attic, handling the pages as if they were sacred relics. The loops of the letters, the slight slant, the way the tail of each G curved inward, it was unmistakable. Barrett sent a sample to the state crime lab for comparison, but they both knew what the results would show. The note had been written by Margaret Vance, a woman who'd been a ghost for over 2 decades, and now she'd left her own newborn son in her mother's barn with a horse she'd known as a child, trusting that something would save him. Why would a mother abandon her baby in such a way? What had driven her to such desperate measures after all these years? The answers would lie in the darkness Maggie had been living in, a darkness that traced back to a single decision she'd made as a teenager, a decision that would now force Elena to confront the most painful truth of her life. Sheriff Barrett stood in Elena's kitchen, the old journal open between them, and pulled out his phone. He'd been on the force long enough to know that missing persons cases never truly went cold. They just waited for someone to ask the right question. Maggie Vance had disappeared 22 years ago from Minneapolis, not from this farm. That meant the case belonged to the city, not his small county. But Barrett made a call anyway, and within an hour, a detective from the Minneapolis Police Department named Karen Liu was faxing over the original file. The pages that came through told a story Elena had never fully known. Maggie hadn't just vanished, she'd been running from someone. According to the file, Maggie had been involved with a man named Victor Crane. He was 8 years older than her, with a record that stretched back to juvenile court. Assault, drug trafficking, witness intimidation. By the time Maggie met him, he was already a person of interest in 3 separate investigations. Friends told police that Maggie had tried to leave him multiple times, each attempt ending with her returning, bruised and terrified. One witness described seeing Victor press a gun to Maggie's forehead in a parking lot, daring her to run again. It was after that incident that Maggie stopped showing up to classes, stopped answering her phone, and then, on a rainy night in October, disappeared completely. The case was classified as a missing person, but with no body and no evidence of a crime, it had languished. Elena had never heard the name Victor Crane. She felt her legs give way as she sank into a kitchen chair, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her daughter hadn't abandoned the family, she'd been hiding from a monster. Barrett dug deeper. He ran Victor Crane's name through the national database and found a man whose life had only grown darker since Maggie vanished. Crane had been convicted of drug trafficking in 2005, served 8 years in federal prison, and was released on parole in 2013. But within months, he'd vanished again, surfacing periodically in connection with a string of violent crimes across 3 Midwestern states. He was currently wanted by the FBI on charges of kidnapping and human trafficking. And according to a confidential informant, he'd been seen in northern Minnesota just 2 weeks before the baby was found in Elena's barn. The dots were connecting in a way that made Barrett's blood run cold. Maggie had resurfaced not because she wanted to, but because she was fleeing for her life and for the life of her child. Elena sat by the hospital bassinet where the baby slept, his tiny chest rising and falling with a peacefulness that seemed almost impossible given what he'd survived. The nurses had grown fond of the boy they'd nicknamed Sam. One of them, a woman in her 50s named Joan, told Elena that she'd worked neonatal for 20 years and had never seen an abandoned infant so healthy. "That horse didn't just keep him warm," Joan said, her voice thick with emotion. "He gave that baby a reason to fight." Elena thought about Samson, back in the barn, standing in the same stall where Maggie had once brushed his mane as a little girl, where she'd whispered secrets into his ears. The horse had known. Somehow, against all logic, that old gelding had understood that the child in the hay was the last piece of Maggie she had left, and he'd protected it as fiercely as any mother. But Barrett's investigation was about to take an even darker turn. He'd contacted the state's Fusion Center, a clearinghouse for law enforcement intelligence, and requested any data on Maggie Vance or her known aliases. What came back made him sit down hard. Maggie had been living under a series of false identities for years, as a waitress in Nebraska, a housekeeper in Iowa, a farmhand in South Dakota. Each time, she'd stayed just long enough to earn some money before moving on, never putting down roots, never letting anyone get close. But 2 years ago, she'd made a mistake. She'd used her real name at a health clinic in Des Moines, seeking prenatal care for a previous pregnancy. That pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage, according to the records, but it was the name that mattered. Victor Crane's people had flagged it, and they'd been searching for her ever since. The baby boy in the hospital was Maggie's second child, and Crane was almost certainly the father. This revelation shifted everything. This wasn't just an abandonment case, it was a potential kidnapping. If Victor Crane had learned about the baby, he would stop at nothing to find him. The FBI was alerted, and agents arrived in the small town within hours, setting up a command post in the county courthouse. They interviewed Elena exhaustively, probing for any detail that might lead them to Maggie. Had she called, written, sent any signal at all? Elena had nothing, but Barrett remembered the note. "Forgive me." He looked at the words again, and this time he saw what he'd missed. A faint indentation at the bottom, as if the paper had been pressed against something else while still wet. Under UV light, a second message emerged, an address, scrawled in the same shaky hand. It was a motel 30 miles north, a rundown place that catered to travelers who paid in cash and asked no questions. Barrett and the FBI agents arrived at the Pine Rest Motel just after midnight. The manager, a nervous man with yellowed fingers and a persistent cough, confirmed that a woman matching Maggie's description had checked in 3 days earlier, using a fake name. She'd paid for a week, but her door was now ajar, the room in disarray. Clothes were scattered across the bed, a cheap phone was smashed on the floor, and a small amount of blood was smeared on the bathroom mirror, along with a message written in lipstick. "I'm sorry, Mom. Take care of him." On the nightstand, a photograph, a teenage Maggie on Samson's back, her smile wide and unbroken, the barn door open behind her. It was the image of a life she'd been trying to reclaim, a safe harbor she thought she might finally reach. But she hadn't made it. Someone had found her first. The FBI agents swept the room, photographing every surface, collecting samples for DNA. There were signs of a struggle, a tipped lamp, a torn curtain, a single shoe left behind. But there was no body and no sign of Victor Crane. For 3 agonizing days, Elena waited by the phone, barely eating, barely sleeping. She visited Sam in the hospital and held him close, whispering promises that she'd find his mother, that she wouldn't let the darkness swallow Maggie whole. And then on the 4th day, a call came in. It was not from the FBI, not from Barrett. It was a woman's voice, weak and trembling, barely audible over the static of a disposable phone. "Mom, it's me." I'm alive, but I need you to come alone. There's something I have to tell you, something about the baby that you don't know yet." And then the line went dead. Elena gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, the phone still warm against her ear even after the line went dead. The voice she'd heard had been fractured by years of fear and exhaustion, but it was Maggie's voice. She'd know it anywhere. Her daughter was alive, and she'd asked her to come alone. Every rational instinct told Elena to dial Sheriff Barrett, to let the FBI trace the call, to do this by the book. But another instinct, older and fiercer, told her that if she failed her daughter now, she'd never get another chance. She grabbed her coat, the keys to her old pickup, and a flashlight from the drawer. She left no note. The drive was a blur of white. Snow had begun falling again, heavy flakes that turned the dark roads into a tunnel of nothingness. Maggie's directions had come in a text message seconds after the call ended. A series of turns that led toward the abandoned lake house the Vance family had once used for summer weekends, a place that held the ghosts of happier times. Elena knew every curve of that road, even in the storm, but her mind was racing with questions that had no answers. Where had Maggie been all these years? Why had she left the baby in the barn, and what was the secret she'd mentioned? The old truck's heater wheezed against the cold, but Elena felt nothing except the pounding of her heart. 40 minutes later, she pulled up to the cabin. It was dark, a sagging structure swallowed by pine trees, its windows like empty eye sockets. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. Elena stepped out into the knee-deep snow, her boots crunching as she approached the door. Before she could knock, it opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared, gaunt and hollowed, with eyes that had seen things no person should ever see. It was Maggie, 22 years older, her once vibrant daughter now a shadow of herself. She pulled Elena inside and latched the door behind them. The cabin was lit by a single kerosene lamp. Maggie wore a man's oversized coat, her collarbones sharp beneath the skin. A bruise spread across her jaw, and her right hand was wrapped in a stained bandage. Elena reached for her, but Maggie flinched, then collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing without sound. For a long moment, they just held each other, the silence filled with years of unspoken grief. Then Maggie pulled back, her expression shifting from relief to urgency. "Mom, I don't have much time," she said, her voice raw. "Victor's men are still out there. They almost caught me at the motel. That blood was mine. I cut my own hand to make it look worse, to buy myself a few hours. But they're smart. They'll check the old family places next." She led Elena to a worn couch and sat down heavily. "The baby, is he okay? Did Samson keep him warm?" Elena nodded, barely able to speak. "He's healthy. They're calling him Sam at the hospital." Maggie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Samson, that old horse, I knew he'd do it. When I was a kid, I found a kitten frozen half to death, and Samson just lay down next to it until it started breathing again. I never forgot that. When I got pregnant, I knew where I had to leave him. It was the only place Victor would never look." She paused, her eyes dark with something deeper. "But there's something you need to know, something I couldn't put in the note." Elena braced herself. Maggie took a ragged breath. "The baby has a heart defect. The doctors in Des Moines called it a ventricular septal defect, a hole between the chambers. Most kids survive with surgery, but he needs it in the first month, maybe sooner. I had it all written down, the medical records, the prenatal ultrasounds. I hid them in the lining of his blanket. I was hoping you'd find them before the hospital discharged him. If he doesn't get that surgery," she couldn't finish. Elena's mind reeled. Her grandson, the tiny boy she'd held only hours before, was sick, and she hadn't known. The hospital wouldn't have checked for a hidden envelope. "I'll call the doctor right now," she said, reaching for her phone. But Maggie grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Wait, that's not the only thing." She reached under the couch and pulled out a small flash drive, slick with blood. This is everything I've gathered on Victor Crane: financial records, witness statements, proof of the trafficking operation. For 2 years, I've been working with an FBI informant in Nebraska. But after I had the baby, my cover was blown. They found out who I was, and they've been hunting me ever since. I can't testify, I'm too sick, but this evidence can put him away for life if you get it to the right person. Elena stared at the drive. Sick? What do you mean you're too sick? Maggie's gaze dropped. I have ovarian cancer. Stage 4. I didn't want you to know. I thought I could just leave the baby, disappear, and let you have a fresh start. But then I realized that Victor would never stop looking for him, not when he learned the boy was his. I had to warn you, and I had to give you this. She pressed the drive into Elena's palm. It's the only weapon we have. Before Elena could respond, a sound cut through the cabin, the crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across the windows. Maggie's face went pale. They're here. She blew out the lamp and pulled Elena toward the back door. But the footsteps were already on the porch, heavy and deliberate. A voice called out, not Victor Crane's, but a woman's, sharp and authoritative. Margaret Vance, FBI, we have the house surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Elena's heart seized. The FBI, but Maggie had been working with them. Why would they be surrounding the cabin? Maggie's eyes widened in terror. No, 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 it's a trap. That's not the FBI, it's one of Victor's people. He's got someone on the inside. We have to run. She grabbed Elena and stumbled toward the back window. As they pried it open, the front door splintered inward. Elena turned to shield her daughter, the flash drive clutched in her fist. And in that frozen moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't leaving without Maggie, and she wasn't letting her grandson grow up without knowing the truth. But the person who stepped through the shattered door was not who either of them expected. It was Sheriff Barrett. He stood in the splintered doorway, his badge glinting in the headlights, his face a mask of deep relief. Behind him, a woman in an FBI windbreaker stepped forward, the same voice that had called out minutes before. But this was not the trap Maggie had feared. Barrett had traced Elena's phone when she didn't answer his calls, and he'd brought real agents with him, ones who had been coordinating with the very informant Maggie had worked alongside for 2 years. The woman agent knelt beside Maggie, her expression softening. Your handler sent us, she said. Victor Crane was arrested 3 hours ago. We got him, you're safe now. Maggie collapsed against Elena, tears streaming down her gaunt face, the flash drive still clutched in her mother's hand. The evidence she'd gathered over years of hiding, the financial records, the witness statements, the proof of a human trafficking network spanning multiple states, was now on its way to federal prosecutors. Victor Crane would not see freedom again, but there was still the matter of the baby, lying in a hospital bassinet with a hole in his heart, and the medical records hidden in the lining of his blanket. Elena immediately called the hospital, her voice steady despite everything, and described exactly where to look. A nurse found the envelope moments later, and within hours, a pediatric cardiologist was reviewing the ultrasounds. The baby, Sam, would need surgery and soon, but the doctor was confident. You found this just in time, he said. The days that followed moved with a strange, suspended rhythm. Maggie was taken into protective custody, but not as a criminal, as a key witness. She was also given a full medical evaluation. The ovarian cancer was advanced, but doctors offered a treatment plan that could extend her life significantly, perhaps enough to see her son grow. For the first time in 22 years, she was not running. Elena visited her every day, bringing photographs of the old farm, of Samson standing proud in the paddock, of the baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Maggie would press the photos to her chest and weep, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of being found. The surgery took place on a Tuesday morning. Elena sat in the hospital chapel, a place she hadn't entered since William's funeral, and she prayed. She didn't know if anyone was listening, but she felt compelled to offer gratitude for all the impossible things that had aligned. The old horse who had remembered a kitten from decades ago, the note that had survived a blizzard, the daughter who had refused to die before telling the truth. By afternoon, the surgeon emerged with a smile. The hole in Sam's heart had been repaired. He would grow up strong, unburdened by the condition that could have killed him within weeks. When Maggie was released from the hospital into a supervised care facility, the first thing she asked was to see Samson. Elena drove her to the farm on a cold, clear morning, the kind where the sunlight made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Maggie walked slowly into the barn, her body frail but her eyes alive. Samson turned his massive head at the sound of her footsteps, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then the old horse nickered, a soft, rumbling sound that seemed to hold decades of recognition. Maggie pressed her forehead to his muzzle, and the animal who had saved her son now stood as witness to her own second chance. But it was what they found in the stall afterward that no one expected. When the hay was being cleared to lay fresh bedding, a caretaker discovered a small metal box, rusted and half buried in the earth floor. Inside was a locket that Elena immediately recognized. William had given it to Maggie on her 10th birthday, a silver pendant engraved with a tiny horse. Inside was a photograph of the Vance family, taken in front of the barn, all of them smiling. Maggie must have buried it there the night she left the baby, a final offering to the place that had been her only real home. And tucked behind the photograph was one more note, written years earlier by a much younger Maggie, full of hope. "Someday I'll come back. Someday this will all be over." She had written that at 16, before Victor Crane, before the darkness. Now, against all odds, her words had come true. The circle had closed, and a little boy named Sam, with his grandmother's steady love and his mother's fierce heart, would grow up knowing that even in the coldest night, warmth can come from the most unexpected places. Samson lived another 2 years after that night, long enough to see the baby he saved take his first steps across the same barn floor. When the old horse finally passed, surrounded by Elena, Maggie, and a giggling toddler who knew him only as Sam, the vet said he went with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all his life. They buried him beneath the oak tree where Maggie had once dreamed of returning, the locket still in her hand. Some stories leave you wondering how many other miracles go unseen, how many desperate mothers write notes that no one ever finds, how many children are saved by the kindness of strangers who happen to be in the right place at the right time. The Vance family's miracle was not just that a horse knew to keep a baby warm. It was that a grandmother refused to stop loving her lost daughter, that a mother risked everything to leave evidence of a monster, that a community rallied around people they barely knew. Most of all, it is a reminder that the smallest act of compassion, a farmer buying a dying horse, a widow checking a strange sound in her barn, can ripple outward in ways no one can predict. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to believe that hope can survive even the coldest night.